Welcome to Adapted, the podcast where we explore adaptations of various forms. I'm today's host, Tom, and with me is.
Pat?
And KJ.
Today we'll be discussing Sherlock Holmes, the books, the stories, various adaptations, and getting into those details. We'll be looking at The Hound of the Baskervilles, the 1939 film, I believe I have that date correct, starring Basil Rathbone as Sherlock. We'll be looking at the 1984 television show version of Sherlock Holmes, the episode Scandal in Bohemia, starring Jeremy Brett as the character, and then the far more recent BBC version Sherlock, Study in Pink, the premiere episode of that television show with Benedict Cumberbatch and his construction of the character. So, what I want to talk about to start off is let's give a kind of brief overview of what we're doing here, who Sherlock Holmes was, who Sir Arthur Conan Doyle was, the career of Sherlock in the books. We know that Sir Arthur Conan Doyle introduced Sherlock Holmes in the 1887 novella The Study in Scarlet, which is the first of four novels and 56 short stories about Holmes and Dr. Watson, which were published between 87 and I believe 1926 was when we had the casebook of Sherlock Holmes. It was an immensely popular character that Doyle had, shall we say, ambiguous devotion to. He kept raising the price of a Sherlock Holmes story in hopes of dissuading publishers from actually picking it up, and they just kept paying more and more money. So he produced more and more Holmes stories. He attempted to kill off the character in the early 1890s, but unfortunately, or for us, fortunately, had to resurrect him in The Hound of the Baskervilles, and then another novel after that, The
To be
Valley
fair,
of
he didn't
Fear.
quite resurrect him in the Sound of the Baskervilles. That was
No,
retconned.
he
That
doesn't
was
resurrect
yeah.
him. That's right. The
He doesn't
Empty
resurrect him
House,
yet.
he resurrects
Yeah,
him in.
he has it go backwards, and he
Yeah, it's a
basically is just
prequel.
like it's a prequel. Yeah,
Hmm.
this takes place before Holmes
Yeah,
died, and then
1901, I think
I
is.
think that was so popular that he was like, oh dang it, I gotta do it again. I think I've heard that supposedly even like the Queen was asking him to like bring it
It's
back.
yeah. Yeah, and he comes back for real, like he is resurrected, or we discover he actually didn't go over the falls in, I think it's 1905, when you have the empty house. And it's interesting to read the later Holmes stories. He seems to set them still in the 1890s because by 1905 you have the Ford Motor Company, you already have the flight of air, you already have the flight of an airplane. You have what 1905 I think is Special Relativity also by Einstein. So 1905 is not a Sherlock Holmes world anymore. Yet the stories were still immensely popular. The character himself is based on a Scottish surgeon named Joseph Bell, who was sort of famous for his deductions. And that is the he is the quintessential detective. I don't think anyone really jumps to mind when you think of a detective more quickly than Sherlock Holmes. And he has also been adapted about a gazillion times by my count. Going back to the silent Sherlock that we watched last week with William Gillette, who is one of the most popular Sherlocks of the 19th and early 20th century. There's a number of German silent films as well that featured Sherlock Holmes. And then we saw Basil Rathbone, who starred in Hound of the Baskervilles, which had to be the most popular of the four Holmes novels, I think. I think it's the best one of the four.
I would say that's
Yeah.
definitely.
And Rathbone played the character 14 times in films, famously hating the character by the end. He was also.
It might say something for this character that everyone that spends a lot of time playing him or writing him hates him.
Yes, yeah. No one seems. I don't know how Cumberbatch feels about him, but Everybody else seems to really struggle with him after a little while. Rathbone did have to fight Nazis at certain points in his career as Sherlock Holmes, so maybe the quality wasn't always that great. We also saw later Jeremy Brett between 1984 and 1994, who seemed to have a warmer relationship with the character. For the Granada television station, they put out 4 seasons. No, not 4 seasons. I think more than that. I don't remember. Anyway, between 1984 and 1994, the Granada television station put out a number of Sherlock Holmes seasons starring Jeremy Brett as the character Sherlock and two actors as Watson, which were quite entertaining. And then more recently, we saw the BBC resurrect the character again with the 4 seasons, I think it's 4 seasons of Benedict Cumberbatch and Martin Freeman as Holmes and John Watson, with the creative team that also resurrected uh, Doctor Who
Which
behind
I
that.
didn't know till I watched this one. I said,
Ye-
"Ooh, Moffat."
yes, yeah, who is playing Mycroft, of course. Um, yeah, and so those are the three versions of Holmes we looked at, in addition to William Gillette from last week. And I do want to start with Holmes and the books and all that. I sat down and I read slash listened to Stephen Fry has great audio recordings of all of the Holmes stuff. So I would recommend that if anybody has Audible. I sat down and went through about 8 books of Holmes in the last month, just to get kind of washed in the character. And they are a delight, but there's also a lot of kind of unexpected things going on. Holmes in Study of Scarlet, he's doing more of the deductions. And he has this idea of science. He writes lots of monographs. He's very interesting. And you pointed out this out last week, Pat, these are romantic adventures. The deductions are rarely the most interesting thing. They're sort of the hook or the shtick to get you into it. But Holmes is, as you pointed out, an adventurer. We are on adventures. They're very romantic. In the early works, he's quoting like Goethe and things like that as well as doing science. And I think that was the most surprising thing for me reading just a ton of Holmes in a very short period is how swashbuckly almost these things are. They're really fun, they're really exciting, but they're not about putting clues together the way maybe Agatha Christie stuff is. Like Agatha Christie, in many of her books, you can kind of figure them out if you sit down and do the work. And there's usually in them pictures of the place where the murder is or something like that. That's not the case in Holmes. Holmes is about the thrill, about going out, about something happening, and things like that. I think that was, for me, the biggest surprise. And so for me, I think what makes Holmes the quintessential detective, even though he's not the first, we talk about Dupin, Edgar Allan Poe's Dupin being really the first detective of this type. But what makes him this quintessential idea of the detective is that he's combining this sort of respect for science. There is no supernatural solution to any of these problems. There's no ghost, there's no vampires, everything can be explained with science and rationality, yet there is still this romantic guy running out in danger who's kind of a superhero also. He knows how to disguise himself in wonderful ways. He knows everything. He knows how to box. He's sort of invincible. He's a superhero. He's our first superhero in a lot of ways. And I think that's what makes him quintessential and what's attractive and surprising about those old books and stories. And I was wondering what you guys thought of Holmes, generally speaking, either from the books or from the adaptations we watched or you've encountered before.
So I know I keep repeating this. This is my introduction to Holmes, and I don't get it. Why do people keep coming back to this? Right? I was under the impression that I was gonna sit here and solve a puzzle with Sherlock Holmes. You cannot. You can, at least in the few that we just watched, There is no way for the audience to figure this out with what's presented. Like you said, Tom, maybe in some of the future ones we're going to do, maybe it's there. Not this. You're just supposed to be impressed that the author was able to write a character who solved a crime that the author made up. I don't understand why we're watching this. I eat each and every one. And if it's for the adventure, there are way better adventure stories than any of these that we watched.
Yeah, I think for me it is the superhero element, right? There is this guy, he's the first superhero, or maybe not the first, but he is superhuman without there being a sort of Beowulf actual superhumanness to him, right? He is part of this mortal coil, yet he is sort of grander than the rest of us. I think that's what is the great appeal of Holmes. And I think it's why it makes adapting him so much fun because you get to see really good actors take that on.
I agree in the sense that yeah, Holmes isn't like the puzzle mystery guy, with the exception, honestly, of Study in Pink, because by the
Yeah.
time I'm like, it's the cab driver, it's clearly the cab driver.
Yeah,
Like,
I know that's
how
very
are you
frustrating.
not getting that this is the cab driver?
Who's in
Yeah, like
pub
it was.
who's in public but hunts? Who's always driving around in public and hunting? No idea.
Yeah, I mean, originally I'm like, okay, it could be like there's a lot of people that could potentially be that are trying to do it, but I was just like, okay. And then when they saw the cab stop and he like got in, he was like, this can't be the right cab driver. This guy's coming from LAX, and I'm like, oh, it's the cab driver. It's clearly you didn't even, and you of all people didn't look at the cab driver. Like again, that was a little bit frustrating. That was just poor writing. This is why you need. This is why my one of my favorite sort of mystery critics is this guy named Ronald Knox, and he has this list of things, and one of his list of things that you have to do in your mystery is that the sidekick has to be slightly dumber than the average reader. So the Watson character always has to be slightly dumber than the average reader because the point is you're supposed to feel better than Watson but never be able to quite get online with the detective. Like that's the idea, that and that's how you're supposed to have fun with it. And if Watson makes this mistake, then I would totally get it. If Watson was like, "Oh, it's clearly not this guy. He just got off the plane from LAX. Can't be him," and ran away, then I would get it. But the fact that Watson doesn't get it, Holmes doesn't get it, that was just dumb. And then when they have the landlady being like, there's a cab out front. They're like, oh, the phone is here. How do we not know? I'm like, come on. There's no way. This is bad writing. It's bad writing. That bothered me. But the point is, yeah, for the most part, you're not supposed to figure it out. But this is what I find, because partly I was getting a little frustrated with the modern with the because I've seen a number of them, and I was getting a little frustrated. I hadn't seen the Benedict Cumberbatch one, the BBC one, and I was getting a little frustrated with it because and I've seen the Robert Downey Jr. one, but they've done it so many times. Like they've done it with how the House show had was basically Holmes, and didn't they have a Lucy Liu one where she was
Yeah,
Holmes
no, she is Watson,
or
and
she's Watson?
Angelina Jolie's ex-husband is Holmes.
Oh, okay. But the idea is that I haven't seen that one, but the
I don't
idea.
remember his name, but
Billy Bob Thornton?
no, her first husband. How badly do you want to see that? That's my answer from last
That's
week.
pretty good. Billy Bob Thornton and Lucy Liu.
That's Holmes and
Pretty
Watson.
good. This is actually pretty good. But the thing is I find it a little frustrating as I was watching it because what there's a tendency to do with Holmes is to just take some characteristic that he has and then just like blow it out, like stretch it.
Yeah, I found
So
that
it's sort of
frustrating
like
too.
the Benedict Cumberbatch one just becomes like this isn't what Holmes really was. It's sort of like he's just blown all out of proportion in terms of his antisocial kind of characteristics to the point where it's like that's not really what he was in the stories. That's not really what he was in a lot of the novels. Like, yeah, he's quirky, yeah, he can do odd things. But I thought, well, maybe this is like the modern equivalent of that. Like you take a guy who sort of bucks some of the conventions and you maybe that was as shocking to contemporary Victorians, Edwardians as it would be to us. Maybe I don't think that's what it is. See, this is where I started thinking that it's almost like Holmes becomes to modern audiences what, say, like Agamemnon was to ancient tragedians. It's this idea that the ancient tragedians, just almost everything they wrote was all the same stories. Everybody knew the stories, they knew how they were generally going to turn out, but they would take the character and then they would plop them in and they would sort of accent different characteristics of that character. So everybody knows him, everybody knows what this person's supposed to be. They're just going to distort him in certain ways to reflect the story that they want to tell. And Holmes, we don't have sort of shared collective figures like that anymore. We don't have a collective mythology that we can sort of use that way. So Holmes
Outside of
is,
Marvel, maybe.
yeah, Marvel is, but again, Marvel, I haven't seen enough Marvel to know, but generally almost always follow the same sort of characteristics, right? There's no,
They make differences because they're in conversation with the comic books, and they necessarily have to abbreviate, so they will make changes. I mean, I think Batman is maybe a better example.
yeah, but those figures in general, just this
Mhm.
idea of we've created these sort of mythic characters and that's how we use them now. So, yeah, this Holmes isn't the same as that Holmes, and they might not even be recognizable necessarily to one another. But what side or what characteristics of that character gets emphasized at any time tells more about the people watching it than it does about the character themselves, I think.
Mhm. Yeah, I think that's true for the successful ones. And I agree with you, Pat. I find um, the exaggeration of Holmes's supposed antisocial tendencies or his drug use, that type of thing that you see in modern interpretations. The Lucy Liu one leans into that too. I think he's a recovering drug addict in that television show. And House leans into that as well. And also he's like a jerk in these things. In House and in the Benedict Cumberbatch Sherlock, he's very, very prickly.
He's completely
He's
unlikable.
completely, yeah, he is. I mean, with Benedict Cumberbatch, I think I find that actor so likable that he's sort of able to get away with it a little more than maybe the Hugh Laurie in Sherlock. But I do find that a little frustrating. I call it the thingness when we have to find a thing, and in Sherlock, he's a high functioning sociopath. They looked that up in a book somewhere and decided that's his thing. That's how we're going to diagnose him. And the earlier versions, the Basil Rathbone version, he's such a sort of nice guy who's really having fun being a kind of superhero, being a Superman who's able to do disguises and figure things out and have adventures. And he's cordial, he's nice to people, and that's how Holmes was. He was a fairly moral character, and he would be willing to throw away the solution to a mystery if the crime aided a moral person, aided a virtue. He was willing to do that. He wasn't necessarily there simply for the thrills, even though he is relying on thrills to get through. I think that is something that's consistent through all of these characters, through all of these interpretations. That
But
leads
he's
back.
not going to have a dance and be like, "Yay, 4 people murdered and
Yeah,
suicides. It's
exactly.
a holiday," and like
Yeah.
dance. And I'm like, no,
Yeah.
I don't think so.
Yeah. No, he's not like that. In the original stuff, he's looking to. He's a moral actor. I still think Holmes in the original stuff, in the original text, is a moral actor. He's not enjoying crime. He's looking to put it away, but he does get bored. I mean, that's the one thing. He does quickly get bored.
It's part of a tendency in a lot of films that I've done. I mean, really, I don't know, really since the '90s, there's a little bit of tendency to do this, and it's especially in like the Good Will Hunting kind of film, which is like the genius has to just be a genius
Mhm.
and just be weird and quirky, and everyone just struggles to understand their minds.
Yeah,
Yeah,
Beautiful
and it's
Mind is the bigger
Beautiful Mind
offender.
does that. Yeah, Beautiful Mind does that. It's this tendency to sort of see genius as so otherworldly,
Hmm.
um, as to just be unapproachable, that no one, and that genius just doesn't function in this society. It cannot follow your petty rules. It's this sort of weird, almost Nietzschean thing
Hmm.
going on with it. But and that's there's that's not new per se. I think in the 19th century you had that a lot with like the Byronic
Hmm.
figures. It was more
Oh yes.
art than it was intellect. Now we tend to be much more interested in the intellect than we are in the art, and so there's this tendency to just see those figures as and to really pull that out. And people still like it. I mean, they like to see smart people being, rejecting convention and therefore emphasizing their otherworldly intelligence. I don't know if it helps people to justify their own antisocial actions, to be like, well, I'm, I just, it's the, the stereotype of like, I just tell it like it is.
Mhm.
I'm not gonna sugarcoat it. I'm like, no, you're just a jerk. So I don't know if that's part of this, is that's
Mhm.
why people really like to watch that nowadays. But I agree. I don't think I'd want to watch that Benedict Cumberbatch one for very long, because I would just get annoyed with him.
Mhm.
I would just not like it. I've seen a lot of the Basil Rathbone ones. I think I like those more. I hadn't seen any of the ones from the 80s. What was his name?
Jeremy Brett.
He seems to strike kind of the middle ground a little bit,
Mhm.
because he's weird, he's quirky, he's a little bit insulting, but he's more insulting as just he just doesn't necessarily notice something, like when they have the King of Bohemia shows up and offers his hand, and Holmes just sits down and ignores him because he doesn't notice, he just kind of
He,
forgets that he
I
should do it.
I think, though, that the King of Bohemia is supposed to be a person who's acted poorly. And Holmes is
Yes.
able to reject those kind of polite things because the King of Bohemia is just, he's not acted well with regard
But
to
I think the
Adler.
idea is that if he, old Holmes, probably still normal, a normal, person of that time period, I think still would be like, well, I have to respect him because of
Hmm.
who he is. I think the idea is Holmes can buck that convention. He can reject it
Hmm.
because he's so moral, because we've grown to like him and trust him as a character. So we will accept his sort of antisocial action here as a sign of his moral superiority to some extent.
Yeah, but I wouldn't call it antisocial. I would call it morally superior.
That's fine. I
Hmm.
can see that as well. But I think it's he does have some tendencies to act a little weirdly, and he'll sometimes say or do things that are like, "Oh, that's a little bit strange," which Holmes does do. There is that sort of tendency amongst him, but it's not like he's as just a complete, I don't know, sociopath, psychopath, whatever. Just like no one would act that way, and it'd
Hmm.
be acceptable. It's just like, I don't care who they are, they wouldn't do it. No
Yeah.
one would do it. And I mean, it's a fantasy, but I just don't think it would work. Um,
It is annoying. And you see in the Cumberbatch one, the way he insults the forensic scientist Anderson, that poor guy, we're not given any reason why we need to dislike this man. I mean, he seems, I don't, like, maybe he has a
the police are incompetent and Holmes better.
yeah, exactly.
That's the only thing.
That's the only thing. We have to just respect competence for all it is, which is a kind of bizarre thing to think about in the modern world. But yeah, I agree, and I like. I think of them, Jeremy Brett was my favorite. I've been going through all of them are on YouTube somehow. I don't know why they're in the public domain, but they are. Um,
No one renewed it.
I guess so. Yeah, I guess like Granada Television was not that interested. But yeah, but I find him intriguing. I love his line readings. I think that's he really has a sort of detail that he puts into that, and I think the Scandal in Bohemia, you see a lot of that, especially when he's dealing with the prince, how he talks to him and whatnot. It's a really lovely thing. I like those kind of details. Um, with Sherlock, the BBC one, I've seen all of them. And they also make the mistake that a lot of media does now, which is we have to keep upping the stakes
That's
all the
Moffat.
time.
That's also Moffat. That's
Oh,
why I
is it?
couldn't stand him in Doctor Who after a while. He
Mhm.
was brilliantly clever with Doctor Who, and then some of he has got some really, really good individual episodes where he's just comes up with really clever and creepy stuff. But when he took over the show, every season had to get bigger and bigger and bigger until it was, the entire universe and all of time will be erased and turned into an orange unless this one child can learn to love his mother. It's like that kind of thing. And it was like, this is one episode. It's like
No.
what is this? But it drove me absolutely up a wall. And Moffat does that to an unbelievable extreme in Doctor Who. So it does not surprise me that he's doing it here too.
Yeah, most of the show follows the contest between Holmes and Moriarty, who is played by, oh, I should remember his name, but he is the most recent Tom Ripley on the new Netflix series. So it's a fitting person to play Moriarty, who's like a young sexy Moriarty, I guess, which is odd. But the show does get gradually.
Professors can be sexy, Tom.
No, well, that's.
And you should
I
know,
shouldn't.
Tom.
Yeah, I did get a review once to that extent, but we won't get into that right now.
Was it about your jawline or something?
It was, yeah, yeah. Yeah,
See,
but
I don't even know if you've told me, but I knew that that's what it would be.
yeah, that's what it was exactly. I'm pretty sure it was from a dude. So, but anyway, um, which doesn't make it illegitimate at all. Uh, yeah. So you were talking, Pat, a little bit about like how these different media items, the different adaptations and whatnot, sort of reflect what people are looking for, um, what they're looking for in homes. And yeah, I agree, especially with the original Holmes, the sort of late Victorian Holmes, who, really is that kind of bridge figure between science and romance, right? He's a person of a scientific era and that kind of revolution. He sort of looks backward towards the Enlightenment and forward towards or looks backward towards the Enlightenment, but also keeps a lot of the fun, the romance, and the melodrama in there. And I think it's also for that period, especially for the 1880s into, let's say, 1920s. Um, he advances realism as well. I mean, I know these things aren't realistic in the way we would think, in a sort of Virginia Woolf's sort of way, but melodrama tends to follow with realism or tends to lead realism. And I think he's combining a lot of Enlightenment ideas of science, finding out the solution with adventure, and those two combine as a sort of possible realism. The stories in Holmes are possible, they could happen. And that I think is particularly modern, and it seems to be what readers in the 19th century were looking for. We're sort of putting aside the Gothic, and maybe Dracula is an exception here, or the Gothic is a sideline, and you have this kind of realistic fun that's able to go on. And so Holmes is this, yeah, he's this interesting figure who's taking what he needs from the Enlightenment, but not really getting bogged down in it. He is still this kind of high romantic character. I think that's what is reflected about the age in the works of Conan Doyle. Um, with Rathbone, I'm not entirely sure. You certainly see it with the Holmes movies where he fights the Nazis, right? And there's a sort of nationalistic pride.
That's like those are the propaganda pieces they
Those are the
got to make.
propaganda pieces, yeah.
That's like the Donald Duck defeating the Nazis kind of thing. Like they just had
Mhm.
to make those. Those
Yeah.
are
But they're in Conan Doyle too, right? I mean
the Nazis.
not the Nazis, no, but he fights.
The
Yeah.
Nazis are not in Conan
The
Doyle.
Nazis are not in Conan Doyle, but Holmes does fight informants for World War One, for the German government during World War One. He takes them out. He's undercover for 2 years, and so there is that still that kind of nationalistic touch in both the Rathbone and in the last story, not the last story, but one of the last stories of Conan Doyle. Um, but I will say, I think the Rathbone one was a lot of fun. We watched Hound for this episode, um, and it's a really fun piece. It kind of reminds me a little bit of the Universal monster movies. It has that kind of atmosphere. It's very thick, the smug and everything. There's no real deductions in it, right? It's just a kind of fun romp through the moors. I really had fun with it. You didn't like it, KJ?
Well, I don't know if I liked it, but the one deduction he came to is you look like the guy in the picture.
Yes.
Which is in the book
Ridiculous.
too.
It is in the
Which is
book.
in the book.
Hmm.
And Pat, you should also bring up it's in the Wishbone episode as well.
It
That's
is in the Wishbone episode.
So I also strongly recommend anytime you are looking for an adaptation to watch the Wishbone adaptation. And this one, it gets a lot of those details correct, doesn't it? It gets the whole walking stick, it gets
Hmm.
the Dr. Mortimer, it's all there.
Hmm. Yes, yeah, and gets the picture correct too. Hmm. Yeah.
It's a dumb way to find a murderer, but
Yeah. Apparently he looked like his relative from 200 years earlier.
yeah, probably about 300. It's
Enough.
supposed to be
Yeah.
during. It's supposed to be during the English Civil War. So yeah,
Yeah.
250 years or so. So yeah.
Yeah, about that. Yeah. That's a stretch.
I mean, he does get a little bit. He gets like the boot. He figures out like why they stole the boot. Um, I think that might be.
Yeah, that'd be
He
it.
figures
Yeah.
out why they wrote the word more instead of cutting it out of the newspaper.
Yes, there you
Um,
go.
but it's it.
Oh yeah.
There were some
There
things,
were some things.
but there were some things. I mean, it's not. I just that's what I think is sort of like the Agatha Christie does that a lot. I'm sure we're doing an Agatha Christie, right?
Next week.
Yeah, and so her books are very much that sort of the idea. I mean, Poirot doesn't do very much at all. He just, occasionally he'll have a stakeout, but that's about it. For the most part, he just sits and puts pieces of information together. And so he's not, that's more I think what people think Holmes is,
Hmm.
and that's what he sort of becomes in later pieces, which is where he's like, the ring wasn't taken off, so therefore it has to be this, that, he
Hmm.
does that sort of thing. That's more what Poirot would do, not really what Holmes does. Holmes does it a little bit, and they do show that in the movie. They do it with the cane. That's the great one with the cane, where he says, okay, he has a dog and he walks a lot, and he's a doctor, and they piece together bits and pieces about the person from the cane.
But in the 39 one, the guy that had the cane wasn't the guy with the dog.
He had a
He
dog,
had
but the
a dog.
dog died and went into the
Yeah.
moor.
So it was a not a misdeduction, but it was
It was
misleading for the
misleading
audience.
and I think that's intentional. In the
That's
book,
fine.
you think, you've obviously just heard the story about the dog, and then you have this guy here and who clearly has had a dog. So, interesting. But they're not wrong that he had a dog.
Mhm.
That's
Right.
it's more supposed to be the point that, they've deduced that he's a country doctor. They've deduced that he moved from the city. They're supposed to pick up little pieces of information, and that's what people sort of think of when they think of the Holmes thing, of the I have go
It's
ahead.
the opening of every story. Every story, Holmes does a deduction. It might not relate to the mystery. When the person comes in, he does the whole deduction thing. It's more prominent in A Study in Scarlet. In The Study of Scarlet, he does a lot of that when examining the crime scene. And it falls off. But you usually see Holmes doing some sort of deduction, either with Watson or with the client as they come in. It doesn't necessarily lead to solving the crime. Usually, what leads to solving the crime is a sort of stakeout thing, or Holmes in disguise and gathering information. Sometimes the crime just resolves itself, or like in the case of the five orange peels, it doesn't get resolved. The KKK just gets away with it in one story, but
Was also like, the one with like the speckled band where like basically everyone just dies anyway. It's
yeah,
like he doesn't do anything there.
yeah,
There's like
yeah.
another one with like, what's the one with like the counterfeiters, where like basically the whole crime has already happened and the guys just come to Holmes to tell him the story.
And then it
It's
blows up, right? That's how
yeah.
they just blow, the counterfeiters blow themselves up. Um,
So Holmes didn't
he doesn't do
Holmes
anything.
doesn't do anything.
The
It's got this
best.
Indiana Jones quality where the whole thing would just have ended the same way without him.
Yeah. The usually the best ones are when there's some weird detail that can't be immediately explained. Like in the speckled band, it's somebody dies screaming, "There was a speckled band," and you're like, "What the hell does that mean?" Or the redheaded league is a lot of fun because it's just this weird setup, and
That
you're
one
like,
actually is pretty good.
"That's really fun." Where it's just like some guy gets hired because he has a certain shade of red hair to copy out the encyclopedia. And then one day he goes to work and there's no one there. And he goes to Holmes and it's like, I think I lost my job, but isn't this a weird thing? And, and it's
It's a
great.
great story. It's
It's a
like,
great
why?
story because
And
it's just,
Holmes has to figure out why this man was hired to copy out why a redheaded man was hired to write out the encyclopedia.
yeah.
And it's a good story,
Mm.
actually. Um, and I guess that's the thing with the Holmes stories, is that they're good stories. They're just not often how people think they are, especially the modern ones. You watch they do it a lot with the from what I remember. I think I only saw the first one with the with Robert Downey Jr. But they do it a lot there, to the point where he can even box using his deduction abilities. Where he knows he can look at them and deduce from the way their ear is bent, like what step they're going to take. Like it's those kind of things where I'm like, that's just not in there. Holmes is more it's his encyclopedic knowledge that's often impressive. When I think in The Sign of the Four, he finds the bit of cigar ash, and he's able to tell exactly from where the cigar came from. And so now and I think nowadays that would be well, that's not that hard. Pretty much everyone they could probably do that pretty easily with science. But then for an individual to be able to do that, to control sort of chaos in that way, that's the appeal of Holmes, is that he controls chaos. Even when things are going all awry, he has the knowledge to hold a situation together. That, I think, is his initial appeal. And I think that's why that's sort of what Rathbone is getting at. Rathbone still has that. He's just, even when everyone else thinks something's going wrong, Holmes already knows it. Holmes already has it figured out. He hasn't done anything about it, but he has it all figured out, and he's gonna round up all the usual suspects and figure the situation out. Like, that's, I think, the appeal of him. Um, and that, I think, just doesn't work the same way nowadays. That's what CSI does. So what is Holmes going to do? So now we've just got to make him something new, and we've got to make the police wildly incompetent at the same time.
Yeah, because Holmes is the original like scientific detective. He writes all these monograms on. I remember he writes one on women's scent. And a good detective has to be able to identify 71 different scents from a woman, those types of things. And you're right. In the modern technological world, you don't need one brain to do this. You have a computer that can do this. But the appeal of Holmes is, still rely on the superhero metaphor. He's one of our first superheroes. He can box, he can go into these great disguises, he can apparently he's very good at calming people down. That's another quality that Conan Doyle often talks about. Like he's incredibly good with women, even though he's not sexually interested in women. He's just able to do everything well and able everything more competently than everyone else, and he's able to do it using things we potentially all could do, even though we can't. I know I can't identify different cigar ashes or what have you. But even the stories, like he can box, right? He's a very good boxer. We learn that about him, um, and so on and so forth. And so I think that's the appeal of Holmes. He's a superhero. And I think that's also what connects him in a lot of ways as a model to the more hard-boiled characters we see later on, who are, as we talked about last week, they're knights. They're knights in the city. Now they're living in a fallen world. Holmes is living in an optimistic world, but he is, what he's taking over the role of a knight in early Renaissance stories, right? Like the Thomas Mallory stories of those knights. Those stories are a little more complicated because the knights tend to be much more gray characters. They're not black or white. As in the Holmes stories, we have black and white characters, and Holmes is a white character there. But they're still kind of they're kind of overpowering and amazing people, and Holmes is like that, except it's grounded. The melodrama, as most melodrama is grounded in a sort of realism. What Conan Doyle uses as that realism is science. There is a scientific explanation for how Holmes is able to do all this stuff, even if we don't see it all the time. We're not going to get a detail about tobacco. I'm sure Conan Doyle didn't know anything about tobacco types or what have you. Um, but I think that's what makes him so appealing, and what makes the
And
Cumberbatch
yet he
stuff.
fell for the fact that fairies existed.
Oh God, I know. We should talk about that. Or he fell for Harry Houdini. He thought Harry Houdini was literally doing magic when he was doing his illusions. But there's a story. We should talk about this. There's a story. Do you know it, about
No,
the?
it's fine if you want it. You can
Oh yeah,
continue.
there's a
Yeah.
story where these two little girls took a photograph of what were clearly cut out images of fairies, and they put them in the grass. And they took photographs of these pictures and said, "These are real fairies we saw." And Conan Doyle staked his reputation on that these were actual fairies. And when
They
the girls
looked so fake.
they look like paper cutouts, which is what they were. And when the girls grew up,
They took dancers. They took dancers.
Mhm,
They were cutouts of dancers, and they put like, sort of like wings on
wings.
there, like gossamer wings on them. And I mean, to be fair, the photos are pretty good. I mean, they do look generally fairly good. But I mean, if you look at them nowadays, you'd be like, that's clearly fake. But yeah, they convinced those the Cottingers, was it?
hmm Oh, I don't
Something like
remember the
that.
names.
I think
Yeah.
it's Cottinger or something like that. And yeah, they convinced the world that fairies existed, and Conan Doyle was like, "They are real.
hmm
All of this is real. These ladies are telling the truth."
Yeah. And when he saw Harry Houdini's routine, he was convinced it was actual magic. And I think it was Houdini himself maybe have had to talk him out of it. Like, no, they're tricks, dude. They're tricks. They're like things. So he was really into he was willing to believe in occult things. But I remember Stephen Fry made this point that thank God that never bled into the home stories, that he never went down that
Would
alley.
have been really bad, yeah.
That would have been really bad. Yes. But mm.
The whole like, oh my, it wasn't a man, it was the fairy who dropped the cyanide in her.
Well, it wouldn't. I don't know
What?
if it would work, right? If Sherlock Holmes had to fight the Wolfman or something like that. I think the Hound of the Baskervilles has a bit of that spirit, the universal monster thing.
It does. I mean, I would agree. I just watched the Bela Lugosi Dracula over the weekend, and then watched Hound of the Baskervilles. There is a definite vibe. I think there's a little bit of the Monster of the Week vibe going on there. I think it's a really atmospheric film. Like I remember watching it as a kid. Again, I think I was like 6 or 7, and I think it was when I had pneumonia. It was like the summer I had pneumonia, and it was like I couldn't leave the house all summer. It was like the worst summer vacation ever. And one of my brothers was like, "You should watch The Hound of the Baskervilles," and that brother was a weird brother, but he is also the brother who was like, "You should watch The Maltese Falcon," and I was like,
Which
"Okay."
one is this? Which brother?
This is the oldest John.
Ah.
I mean, in retrospect, he's right because I did really like the movies, and I look forward to introducing it to my own children. But
Mhm.
at the time, it's an odd thing to do.
Mhm.
Um, but I remember watching it, and it's very, and I'm sure I didn't really totally understand what was going on, but it's very atmospheric. Like I remember thinking it's really just a cool atmosphere. And in some ways I wish, because he used to say he had read the book before he watched the movie, and he was like, I was terrified when I read the book because he thought the book was so scary as like a little kid. And I can sort of get that. Like the book is kind of creepy. There's a lot of stuff in the book that's not in that movie that they had to cut for some reason, some of it. They had to give him a love interest, I guess.
Mhm.
So they couldn't in the book, KJ, the woman is not she does not end up with the Baskerville at the end.
With him.
she's
Mhm.
she's
Mhm.
actually the
Oh,
husband of the murderer.
yeah,
Or the
she's the
wife, sorry,
wife.
the wife
Mhm.
of the murderer. She's the murderer's wife, and they're pretending that it's his stepsister. And so he actually gets really mad when Baskerville starts flirting with her and all this stuff because it's not the way that's supposed to go.
Does the dog live in the grave in the book?
Yeah,
He lives in a
he
grave.
locks him up in the
Oh,
grave at night, and that's what they keep hearing, the howling all night. And he covers him with in the book he
oh.
covers him with phosphorescent paint, so the dog when it's bounding across the moor is literally like a glowing green every time anyone sees it,
Oh.
which is pretty cool.
Mhm.
So
Um,
that made it in the Wishbone episode,
yes, that did make
not
it in the
into the
Wishbones
movie.
Mhm.
episode.
And then I don't know if this was an adaptation or if this just started a great line, but the guy with the cane says, "I'm a bit of a doctor myself, you know," which is famously said in the first Tobey Maguire Spider-Man movie by William Dafoe.
I'm a
I'm a
bit of a
myself.
I didn't notice that. I didn't notice that at all. It's actually really good.
Mhm. Oh, that's probably deliberate.
Right?
Hmm
I can
Yeah.
imagine those
I
guys
can
harkening
imagine them
back to.
taking lines of that kind of thing. Yeah, I mean, there's
Mhm.
things in the modern Sherlock that are clearly just holds from the novels.
hmm
Like I remember the whole thing with the phone. I remember that's a whole
That's a
sequence in the.
watch.
It's a
And
watch. It's a whole sequence in the Sign of the Four with the watch, and it's like, oh, you can tell he's drunk because of where he isn't it? It's where he
Mhm.
winds the
It's where he
key.
winds the watch. It's like tinted or binged or what have you,
Yeah,
because the drunk is not able to put the key in the lock.
which that's clever. I mean, some of
Yeah.
it's clever.
hmm
I sort of enjoyed some aspects of what they did there. Um, others I just thought were kind of silly. But like that kind of thing, I thought, oh, that was a clever little homage to like an earlier thing. So there's a couple things I think in that in the
It would have been nice if they showed us the cell phone first so that we could have played along.
Yeah,
I don't think we see the cell phone until they say,
they
"Look, it's got names on it now." Yeah, and I'm
they
like, "Oh
zoom
well."
in, yeah, and do the
Yep.
the close up. Yeah, I.
and then they go like wet, dry.
Mhm. That was very annoying. The text that would pop up on screen to let us know what he was thinking. Um,
No. Wait. In the BBC one,
Yeah.
that was what they were texting, not what they were thinking.
No, they did
it
it on
was
the when he
texting
was
and
investigating.
thinking.
There was texting. It was also when he looked at the body of the woman.
When he
Oh, you're
takes out
right.
the
You're right.
ring,
Yeah,
it's like
that was annoying.
clean,
Yeah.
dirty,
Yep.
clean, dirty. Yeah,
Yeah, that was.
yeah, I
Yep. There
found
was the
that
text. Yep. Yep.
really, really annoying. I don't know how else you deliver that message, but I guess you could just show the ring and you could figure out, oh, it's clean and that part's dirty, or there's water there.
I
Um,
mean, I think normally they have the detective be like, "Notice how her cuffs are dirty." Like that's normally what they do. So I think they were trying to find a way to get around that problem. There's an interesting dilemma, which I was, I find I've read that things that taught, sort of just theories of detective fiction, which it's interesting to see when they adapt it. That one of the reasons why almost always the detective, with the except when you get to noir fiction, it's different because they're always lone wolves. But especially this sort of detective fiction, they do it with Poirot does it, Holmes does it, and Auguste Dupin do it. That you can't get access to the genius's brain because if you do, well, then that defeats the whole point. So you have to have so this is, Poe comes up with the way to get around the problem is he's like, I'll have a slightly dimmer sidekick who just goes along and narrates it all. So it's, yeah, and that's how you can do it in literature is you always have to have this slightly dumber sidekick who follows them around. And you don't have to do that with film. So the sidekick's role is like, what is this? Because you can easily do it in film. You can easily follow behind
mm,
someone and not have access to their thoughts. It's actually hard to get access to their thoughts. It's actually, this is the problem that they're trying to come up with when they do the wet, dry, dirty ring, 10 years
mm,
old. They're trying to be like, how do we actually get the access to his thoughts? I can't do it. So there's an opposite problem here. So it almost becomes, well, what does the sidekick do in these shows? Like they have no function anymore. Their whole function is to narrate the story to the reader. So in some ways, the Watson characters become even more useless in the films.
yeah, he works fairly well for Hound, but that's only the particulars of the story of
Yeah,
Hound.
because Holmes isn't there for most of
Yeah,
it.
so you actually need Watson to go forward and do things.
So is it a Watson POV in the book?
Yeah,
Yes.
Watson's always the narrator.
Interesting.
Yeah, he's
Okay.
always the narrator.
Oh, for all the
Every
books?
single
Yes.
one. Yeah.
It's always first
Oh,
person narration from Watson's perspective. The conceit is that it's not just that it's that Watson is publishing the story of Sherlock Holmes in the paper. So what you are reading is Watson telling you, publishing the story in the newspaper after the fact. And Holmes becomes famous because Watson is publishing his stories. And that's why everyone knows who Holmes is as they get moved further and further along
Mhm.
in the stories, is because Watson is publishing his stories. So there's actually
oh,
a
he's
little bit of
published them in
meta
real
in
time.
real time. So
Yeah.
there's a little bit of like
Mm.
meta going on with
Mhm.
it in that they reference old stories that are published as if Watson wrote them and not Tolkien wrote them. Or
Yeah.
not
Or
Tolkien,
I
Conan
was
Doyle.
yeah,
just
Conan
about to
Doyle.
bring up Tolkien,
Yeah.
and I was going to say, is this a continuation of the Red
No,
Book?
this
It's
is
similar. It's actually in certain ways, Tolkien and Conan Doyle are doing similar things. Because while there are actual stories that are referenced, Studying Scarlet is referenced, Sign of Four is referenced because that's where Watson meets his wife. But there's a lot of stories that you get the name of the mystery, but they're not things Conan Doyle wrote. They're just random little things, and it's Watson will say it was like the mystery of the five buckets, blah blah blah, and that's not a story he wrote. Actually, years later, his son would write several of them. He would go through and go like, okay, what actually is a random reference, and he made them into stories with a co-writer. But
to quote Disney, what intellectual property can I mine?
yes, yeah,
Mine.
to quote the Disney company over the last 100 years, um,
But that
and
was an actual quote from their last earnings call.
Oh, was it really?
Yes, it was. We
Oh,
are we are we are we are consistently looking for more intellectual property to mine. Like,
ah,
yeah, that's Disney's vision.
yep.
Yeah, yeah.
Fair enough. It was,
We could come up with great ideas, or we
hmm.
could mine intellectual property.
Fair, yeah. Well, but Tolkien does that too in Lord of the Rings. I mean, he has lots of references, some of which are explained, some of which are not explained. And it creates this sort of, it's a world building tactic, right? If you can have a character in world say, oh, it was like the case of X, Y, or Z, and you as a reader don't know, it gives the illusion that this world is far deeper than you have access to. And so he does that all the time in the stories. Yeah, the Watson dilemma is interesting because we saw last week with the William Gillette movies, they just sideline
It
him. Just
just
so,
because he
hello,
has no purpose.
bye. Yeah, he has no purpose, so just get rid of him, which seems fair enough. And in the Jeremy Brett one, he also kind of has no purpose.
Well,
He's just
he has to throw the
oh,
smoke
the
thing
smoke
Smoke
in.
bomb.
thing into the
He
room.
occasionally has a function like that, but then he just sort of becomes like, well, Holmes could have just got Miss Watson to or Miss whatever her name is, Miss Hudson to do that.
Yeah.
You know, like that didn't really require
Mm,
That require a doctor.
yeah. And it seems in the one thing I can appreciate about Sherlock is they are really struggling to make Watson have a reason there, right? Have
Yes,
a purpose
that is the
there.
exception. I think they
Yeah.
fixed that problem in that show. They actually
Mm,
really give him a purpose.
mhm. They give him a purpose, they give him a backstory. I really like the inversion of the war trauma, that it actually isn't war trauma that is holding him back, it's the lack of
I
excitement.
thought that was clever.
That
That
was
made
really
I
clever. I
actually
liked it a
liked
lot.
that. I liked that.
Yeah.
The Wishbone guys nail Watson pretty good, right?
Yeah.
On the flip side, could you imagine having to act out a Sherlock Holmes thing where Sherlock was the dog? You're standing in a room and the dog is figuring everything
There's
out.
a great sequence where they have like the dog like standing over his shoulder, and the actors like talking, responding to him, and like of course there's nobody actually saying these things, so the actor is just standing there being like,
So
"There was a
nice.
hound, a giant hound, neither man nor woman." This person is just sitting here being like, "I went to Tish for this."
Oh Lord. So I was wondering. So my favorite Holmes of these was still Jeremy Pratt. I
Of these,
think,
yes, I would
yeah,
agree. I
I
like some of the
I
most.
just love I not all the other episodes are as well made as I think that one, but even I like the direction in that episode. It's they're clearly very conscious of where they put the camera and whatnot. Um, but I think there is something kind of otherworldly about him, and he seems to be having so much fun playing that character. Like he's just laughing out loud, and I his line readings I think are the most thrilling of them. And as you said, Pat, he's sort of balancing between the thingness of Cumberbatch, where there has to be a thing. You know, this guy just can't be a somewhat super person. He has to have a cognitive distance from the rest of us that has a diagnosis attached to it. And the Rathbone, who and I think Rathbone is sort of more similar to the everyman. He's not an everyman, but he's closer to that. I loved
I mean,
Rath.
you could essentially take. I like Rathbone, I like his character, I like his
Mm,
presentation, but you could more or less just take him and stick in any detective. Like you could just
mm,
have it be anyone. It could be an army sergeant, and no one would bat an eye. Like there's nothing particularly notable
mm, yeah. And I
other
think
than
there,
his ability to disguise himself as a peddler.
yeah, which was fun. Yeah, I like that disguise. I didn't catch it at first, even though I read the book just before.
I didn't catch it again. I've read them all many
Mm.
times, and I didn't pick up on the red when the again the '80s one. What was his name?
Oh, Brett.
Brett, when he disguises himself as the redhead and like
Hmm.
that whole with the giant sideburns, and I went, "Oh, that was good."
I
Like
I
I
didn't catch it
had
either. Yeah, yeah.
no idea that it was the same actor. I had no clue. That was well done.
Mm.
Kudos to them.
Yeah. But I think he is having the most fun playing that character. And the television show doesn't seem to need to explain him in some way. It's the problem I think also with Sherlock, with the BBC one, is it's Sherlock's story. It's the story of Sherlock Holmes, which becomes more and more intense as the episodes go along. I know we only watched the first one, but I think it's even clear in the first one that this is the story of Holmes. When the detectives talk about stuff, a lot of them are talking about Sherlock Holmes and his behavior. They're not talking about the case as much as they're talking about him. When they talk to Watson, it's all warnings about how Sherlock is one day going to be the killer, which I found utterly unconvincing that that's going to happen, that this man is going to one day become a psychopath and be responsible, and so he's actually a dark figure that we need to keep our eye on. And isn't that interesting? That rang utterly false to me in that moment. Um, and while he is the attraction, the mysteries themselves are the things that are interesting eventually. And I think that's what makes the Brett in action as the Brett construction as well as the Rathbone construction really interesting. It isn't about Holmes. It is about these mysteries, and we become intrigued or interested in Holmes because of the mysteries.
And I would agree with that, especially because it explains the whole reason for our earlier criticism of like, how did you not realize it was the cabbie? And the reason is the writers didn't care. You know,
Yeah, yeah.
that wasn't what they were actually writing about. The whole point wasn't to have a mystery for Sherlock Holmes to solve. It was to put Sherlock Holmes in a position where he would put his own life on the line in order to prove how intelligent he was. They were coming up with a scenario for the character of Holmes, not for a mystery for him to solve.
Mhm.
It was sort of it was secondarily, and so they just didn't really care that that particular aspect didn't make sense, and that they didn't have to explain it because that wasn't what they were writing for. That wasn't where their focus was. They were just trying to put Holmes in a specific scenario that they wanted to put him in.
Mhm. Yeah, I agree. I agree. And that continues through those episodes, through the introduction of Holmes's family and other members of Holmes's family and what have you. Um,
I liked the presentation of Mycroft. I did actually like Mycroft there.
and Mycroft's fun through them all. So Mycroft, we should say, in the original stories, and this is represented very well in the Jeremy Brett, the Greek interpreter, which is where we first meet Mycroft. We meet him in, I think, three different stories. The Final Problem, the Greek interpreter, and I don't remember the third one, but it might be the Valley of Fear. But anyway, in the Greek interpreter, we meet Mycroft, and Mycroft is better at deductions and smarter than Holmes, and he does supposedly run the government somehow, but he's apparently incredibly lazy. Like he just doesn't, he's not going to get up to figure out if his solution is true. He just wants to sit there, and the reason why he gets involved with Holmes is because, or the reason why Mycroft calls on his brother Sherlock is that Sherlock will actually run around and figure things out, and Mycroft's just far too lazy to do that. And
It's
I
supposed to
like,
be that Mycroft is supposed to just be that he just knows how everything works. So everyone he becomes like the Oracle at Delphi. Like everyone just goes to him and asks him questions and then leaves. And then when someone else comes and asks him a question, he knows every question that's again, it's sort of like again, it becomes almost like AI. He becomes like trained in every single aspect of the government because people constantly keep coming to ask him questions. So he's become the central nerve point. So I think it's sort of the idea is like if you ask him how two totally unrelated things are related, he can actually relate them because he's the only person that has all the information of the government in one place. So that's how they say he sort of runs it because he's the only one that just knows everything. It's just he has all the information centralized in one place. But yeah, he's supposed to just be exceedingly lazy and never wants to go anywhere.
yeah, and that's why he gets involved with his brother because his brother will run around and make calls. I remember at one point the brother has to like send a telegraph. Sherlock has to send a telegraph to get an answer, and Mycroft's like, "Ugh, that sounds exhausting. I can't believe you got up and sent a telegraph. I would never do that. Thank God I called you." uh, but in Sherlock, he's a yeah.
I liked it. I thought it
I
was
liked it. It's
fun.
a
I
lot
thought
of
it was
fun. Yeah.
because again, when I didn't know it, and I'm like, I'm guessing when they were talking about him, and it was like he was trying to bribe him to spy on him. I'm like, I'm guessing this is Mycroft. I was like, I'm assuming, in which case that's funny and clever. And then when it was, I was like, yeah, that was
Mhm.
well done. That was a good touch. I enjoyed that.
Yeah. Yeah, and he's
I
in
had
a
to look
few of
for
the
things.
episodes. Yeah, he's in a few of them, and he's good. That is Moffat himself, right? Who's playing that?
I didn't know that it could be.
Yeah, I believe that's him who's playing that character. Oh, Pat, I wanted to, before we close up here, you had mentioned last week about the Greek tragedy, Sherlock Holmes as a Greek tragedy. Wonder
Well,
if
I
you wanted
was
to go
saying,
into that in a little more detail.
yeah, I mean, I kind of mentioned it already. It's just this idea, I think, that if you look at like a lot of Greek tragedies, like they're essentially take Agamemnon. They're all essentially Greek tragedies are all they're all pulling from Greek myth with only currently extent only one exception of all the Greek tragedies we have. Only one doesn't come from myth. They're not pulling from recent events. So everybody knows the stories. Everybody knows the characters. They don't really have to do much with them. So if you take Agamemnon and Aeschylus will treat him one way and Sophocles will treat him another way and Euripides will treat him another way and even in the same the same playwright will treat them in different ways at different time periods. So it was more that it was the idea I was saying earlier, which is I think that it originally sort of bugged me a little bit that they were sort of manipulating him and sort of altering how the character looked and compared to the novels. And I thought, well, this is just if we're looking at adaptations, I think with a character like Sherlock Holmes, you can get away with it now. I don't if you did that with, say, Lord of the Rings. We already, we've talked about this one before, but if you did with Lord of the Rings and you took Gandalf out and you totally changed the character, I don't think you can do that. Like, I think that material is still so tied to it that if you alter that character, it just doesn't work in an adaptation. I think Holmes is now at this point you can. He's almost like a public domain. He's like a mythic Greek tragic hero where you can just pluck him out and pop him into different scenarios and sort of with the same stories that everybody sort of already knows and just alter how you view them and it changes how you see the character and how you see the scenario. And so I think it's a unique adaptation in the sense that most adaptations, I don't think you can do that. I think if you do it, you betray the source material. I don't think it's actually true with Holmes anymore. And I don't think I don't really like the Benedict Cumberbatch one, but that's a different reasons. Neither do I like the Robert Downey Jr. one. But not because of what they did to the source material. I think now you can do that. I think that character is essentially it's mythic now. Do what you want with it, or as you said, it's sort of like Marvel Comics. They're mythic. Do what you want with them now. They're not. You can sort of alter them and change them and do what you want with them in a way that I don't think, as long as it's still recognizable to the source material, you can do it now, and I don't think anyone will complain.
Kind of a side note, have you guys seen Into the Spider-Verse?
Yeah, I saw the first one.
Yeah, the first one. So Pat, Into the Spider-Verse, you're following Spider-Man, but it turns out the Spider-Man story happens all the time. So a bunch of Spider-Men come together, but each time the story is a little different. I mean, it's the same story, but different scenarios. And I was just remembering, Tom, there's Spider-Man Noir in that. I think played by Nicolas Cage.
Yes, there is. Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's a good reference though, the Spider-Man thing or connections to it, because if you look at older stories, let's say stories before 500, 1500, you have myth either in Greek, in Rome. You have Arthurian legend, which is, if you've ever seen the web of different Arthurian legends out there, they're in Dutch, they're in German, they're in French, they're in English, they're all over the place, and they're
But you
different
can do whatever you
interpretations.
want. That's a good example
You
too.
could
You can
do
do whatever
whatever
you
you
want
want
with
with
them.
them.
Like
Yeah.
Arthur has to be a certain way. Galahad has to be, the noble one, or whatever it is. Each one and they each, there's sort of relationships among them that are set in stone, and there's certain characteristics that they're supposed to have. But after that, do what you want with it.
Yeah.
It sort of becomes a free for all.
Yeah, the good example is the Sacred Grail, the mystery of the Sacred Grail. There's different knights who go get it. Like Lancelot tries to get it in one, Percival, Galahad, depending on who you're reading. And so you can kind of fill them in. But the reason why it fails or succeeds, I know with the Lancelot one, it's because he slept with Guinevere, which is pretty consistent amongst the stories. And so it's particular to that character, and yet it's unique to the author who's writing that. And with the Spider-Man story, I think there's sort of the same thing. Like Uncle Ben has to die. He has to die.
Yeah,
Everything has to die. There
it's a
is
good
a
example. Yeah.
yeah, there's a Gwen Stacy or a Mary Jane. He's attracted to her. He's got to be kind of nerdy, so maybe he can't like date her right away because of his nerdiness. But there's some sort of attraction there. And he has to fight one of these 12 villains. We know who they are. We got to fight one of them, right? Um, Venom is the most popular one, but whatever. You could put Green Goblin in there if you want to. That's fine. And I think that is why maybe right now we're living in an era that is, I don't know, somewhat similar because all of the superhero characters, with the exception of maybe Thor, which I don't think they know what to do with, they're sort of science-based, right? The idea of Spider-Man is there's a scientific explanation as to why he can do the wonderful things he can do. And that's true with all of these characters. And there's a stock of them, and we know what they do, but we can put them in different arrangements. We know what Wolverine does. He talks a certain way, he looks a certain way, he has a certain attitude. If you had a bubbly, happy Wolverine, regardless of what he looked like, that would not serve your audience. That just would not do. In the same way, you can't confuse Percival, who's pure of heart, and Lancelot, who is a great knight but is corrupted by lust. Right? You can have them doing the same things, but Lancelot is going to be somewhat corrupted because of his affairs, and Percival just isn't. He's going to be able to do different things, even if you put them into the same story. And that seems to be the case with Holmes. It's when the character, and Holmes is kind of an outline of a human, right? He's not a full human. He's not like somebody you would find in William Faulkner. Like Faulkner could not write a Holmes. Faulkner would just give us too much and would
Well, again, I
trap
think
him.
I quoted some, I can't remember which critic it was, but there's some critic who says something along the lines of Holmes isn't really a character. He's an attitude with some catchphrases.
Yes,
It's
exactly.
just like
Mhm.
he doesn't, there's no actual character there.
Mhm.
Speaking of catchphrases, in Wishbone, I finally got my line. Elementary, my dear Samantha. They finally.
Ah, excellent. Yeah. But that, yeah, I guess somebody like Holmes is the revival of Greek myth.
Well, I think it also part of me wonders. I mean, I would love to know if like when they went back, if you could go back and watch some Greek myths, if somebody was like, well, why was Agamemnon so different in this one? Like he didn't. I don't like how they're changing Agamemnon. Like I wonder, like I actually really do wonder if these were the types of discussions going, because it's we don't even totally accept the convention that you can take these characters and totally alter them. We have to sort of justify it to some extent. So I do wonder whether people were having conversations like that and were basically saying, I didn't like how they did Hercules in that one. Heracles he was too wimpy in that one. I think they should, but I don't know. I'm actually really curious what they thought of these characters sort of reoccurring with very different qualities, but still recognizably the same characters, whether that would have bothered them at that time period or not.
Yeah, what the tolerance was for flexibility within these characters. You saw that
Yeah.
with the new Star Wars, where people were mad as hell that Luke Skywalker was behaving in certain ways. I don't remember what they were mad about, but they did not like that Luke Skywalker was what, a hermit now or whatever. I
He
don't
was a
even
hermit.
remember.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
saw
yeah,
the second one. I
I
think that
did
was the
too.
last movie I saw in the theater,
Yeah,
which was what?
but that ended the experience for you apparently.
No, having children ended that
Oh,
experience.
yes. Yeah. But people were mad that Luke Skywalker was not the Luke Skywalker of earlier things.
That was not what bothered me about those movies, but
No, it wasn't what bothered
that's a
me
different.
either, but that was a discussion people were having,
Yes.
right? I think that is a discussion. It'd be interesting to see how much of that is the fact that you can have a canon, and I wonder how much of a canon you could have had in 400 BC, right? That's kind of existing outside of just our heads. That's on paper somewhere or whatnot. Um, but it would be interesting to see because there's a really good argument about the construction of the Odyssey and the Iliad, that they were actually part of oral tradition for years and years before they got written down. And people have made pretty convincing arguments to that extent. And if that's the case, then oral tradition would be enough to kind of preserve these things as canonical or not. And that would be, yeah, that would certainly be
Well,
very
what's
interesting.
But it's true. But I mean, even say within, you're right. There's probably those things were being passed down before they were written down. They were being passed down before they were written down. But even within Homer, for example, there's a lot of evidence that there are certain things that later tradition would apply to that story weren't that Homer did not incorporate them. One of the most, the for example, the Judgment of Paris, that's not really in Homer. That's not till later, and it sort of gets grafted on, and so people are kind of adding elements to it as they go. And there's even some things within Homer where people are like, that's weird, that's not what anyone else says. Like, why would they do that? I'm reading, like, I was reading some Greek tragedy recently, and there's one where one character introduces Odysseus, and they're like, this is Odysseus, the son of Sisyphus, and everyone's like, why did you do that? Like,
Mhm,
that's not at
mhm,
all. So I mean, you have to imagine that a Greek audience would be like, why did he do that?
mhm,
Oedipus is not the son of Sisyphus. Why did he say that? So
mhm,
there's sort of this element of like they still messed with them in sort of fundamental ways.
mhm,
So even if there was sort of a canon which they could pull from, they still altered it. I
mhm.
think in unexpected ways that they would go do it. I think I've seen things where it's like there's the story of like the Bacchae, where at the end of the Bacchae, Dionysus just goes on a murder rampage and kills everyone. And yet there's other Greek tragedies by the same authors in which he'll say like, and then Dionysus sat down with them and had a nice picnic. Like it's not like they're sort of like, so what actually happened there? No one
Mhm,
seems to know, but they just change it based on what they want the
mhm,
story to be. So there's an interesting thing going on where they have a lot of freedom, and I feel like that's what these characters have become. And you can adapt them legitimately in that way. I don't think, as much as I don't really like the Cumberbatch one, but that doesn't mean it's a bad adaptation. It can still function as an adaptation. That character has almost transcended its own material. I think it's an interesting thing that's happened with Holmes. He's no longer bound to that material. He's just become his own cultural entity. He's not bound to his source material anymore. People can kind of do what they want with him. And I think it's totally legitimate. You can't do that with something, I would argue. You can't do that, although I think Netflix is trying. You can't do that with J.R. Tolkien, but in the same way. But you can kind of do it with Holmes.
I'm just drawing this connection. So is House called House because it's
Yes.
another way to
Yeah,
say wow.
yeah. It's House and Wilson is
Holmes.
Watson.
It's Watson.
Yeah, I think that's the
Yep.
name of the of
It's making sense. Yeah, the guy from Dead Poet
yeah,
Society.
my
Hmm.
former
Oh yeah.
Robert Sean Leonard, my former neighbor.
I forgot about it.
Really?
Yeah, he used to live next to me. I met him once.
With James Earl Jones?
That was when I met, yeah, when I ran into James Earl Jones. He was in a really good production of A Long Day's Journey into Night, Robert Sean Leonard,
Ooh, that
and
would be fun to see.
yeah,
I mean, it
it
can't
was
be
with
because it's
him, it
amazing.
was with oh, what's his name? The blonde actor who was Truman Capote, um
Philip Seymour Hoffman?
Philip Seymour Hoffman,
Oh, I remember
and
that. That was on. It
Vanessa
was like
Redgrave.
2008, wasn't it?
Mm-hmm.
It
Yes,
was
yeah.
like 2008. I was gonna see it and I never did. I'm
Oh,
so disappointed I missed that. I
well,
bet
I
it
knew
was
his
awesome.
parents, so I got to go backstage and all
Oh,
that. So it was,
would
and
have loved to have seen that. I should have gone.
it was
Oh,
really good. It was a really, really good production of that. And apparently, for some reason, James Earl Jones was backstage also. So it was, yeah, there you go. But
I love Long Day's Journey, and I really like Philip Seymour Hoffman, so I should have gone see it. I think it was like summer of 2000. It was like 2008 when I just moved to New York City and was like, I have to make rent. I can't go.
yeah.
I can't go see plays.
Mhm. Oh no, that was wonderful.
I'm going to make an adaptation called James Earl Holmes.
Yeah.
I've seen James Earl Jones live a couple times, and he wasn't great.
Hmm.
I saw him in a really weird production with I think Vanessa Redgrave, actually, of Much Ado About Nothing, um, where they played Benedict and Beatrice, but they were like 80. I
Yeah.
mean, they were pretty old, and it
Hmm.
just was like it was also just weird because they tried to set it during World War I,
Hmm.
which just doesn't ring true when you get to the end and when they get to the beginning and they're like, "How was the battle?" And they're like, "Good, and we lost few men and none of any note." I'm like, it doesn't work with World
Sound
War
like
One.
World War One.
It's not like World War One, and they tried to kind of set it in this like jazz age
Mhm.
thing, but I think they were trying to be like, oh, the crushing, terror or awfulness of World War I is harming the comedy, and I'm like, This just doesn't work. It was a really weird production. I saw him in that, and I saw him in like another one. I don't remember the name of it, but it was like a political one about like the 1968 Democratic Convention, and it was pretty awful. Supposedly there was like when they had James Earl Jones, because the only two actors that knew that he would say, "Luke, I am your father," or "No, Luke, I am your father," was the only two people who knew it were Mark Hamill and James Earl Jones, because they were trying to keep it a secret. And so James Earl Jones apparently read it and went, "Oh, he's lying. He's clearly lying." So they had to add the scene. And so I guess like both of them were like, "Wait, he's lying, right?" And they're like, "No, no, he's telling the truth." And it was like, yeah, no one's gonna get that. Everyone's just gonna assume Darth Vader's lying. So they added the scene supposedly where like Luke is lying in the thing, and he's like talking to Vader telepathically, and he's like, and then Luke accepts it, and so it's like, okay, if Luke accepts it, then hopefully
We
the
can accept it.
audience accepts it,
Mhm.
because they basically were like both Hamill and James Earl Jones were like, well, he's lying.
Yeah, yeah. Well, on that note, any final thoughts on Sherlock Holmes, Greek myth, James Earl Jones, Darth Vader, or anything else we've covered today?
Holmes is fun, but I don't want to see anymore.
I think we take a break. I will say something I don't think you can do with Holmes. I don't think you could do with Hercule Poirot, who we're covering next week, what you can do with Holmes.
No,
I
you
think
can't,
Poirot is
because
still trapped.
he's still tied to his material
Yeah, I think he's
in a
still
way that Holmes is not.
trapped in those stories, in those
Holmes has
novels.
transcended it, and this
Mm.
is, I think, is unique. There's not a lot of intellectual property that does that, especially written ones. But Holmes has transcended it. He's no longer tied to his written material. I think it's weird. I think it's of all the things we've done, other than maybe like Willy Wonka, you can kind of pull him out. He's another one that's kind of just sort of waffling along in his way. It might speak to the fact that the characters aren't that well written, or it speaks to the fact that they're sort of become universalized in a way that everybody generally knows who Holmes is. I think most people could recognize Willy Wonka, and yet you can kind of plug them in all over the place now. They've transcended their source material, and Poirot has not.
Yeah, yeah. He can a new Poirot case would be odd, right? But anyway,
You could make a new case, but the problem is you can't change the character in fundamental ways. Like even, Branagh's weird giant mustache thing people had issues with. Like they changed the mustache and people had issues with it.
and
You
that's
you know,
still that stuff is still, I think, tonally different from the the novels, but it's still
not fundamentally.
no, no. I think it's totally different. It's not in any way plot or genre different. I
No.
mean, you're basically following the novels. I haven't seen Haunting in Venice yet. I'm told that's a little different, but
What is Haunt? I've never heard of it, but
or the Murder in Venice, the haunt, whatever it was. It's the
Death on the
third one.
Nile?
No, Death in the Nile's the second one.
Oh, I didn't even know there was a third one.
There's a third one that with Tina Fey that's based on I can't remember the name of it. It's like a Halloween one,
I don't know
but
that one at
it's one
all.
with a
Fascinating.
seance and there's a ghost and it's like I haven't seen it, but it looks very different from the others.
As I've said with Branagh, you know your career is at rock bottom when everyone's just waiting for you to do Lear. Everyone's
Yeah.
just like, so when is he gonna be old enough to do Lear?
Yeah.
He's getting close, right? He'll do Lear
We
soon.
got 10 more years until his,
He's gonna
and he's
do Lear
definitely
soon.
filming Lear, right? We're gonna get the big 4 hour Kenneth
You
Branagh
have
Lear.
he has to do Lear. If he doesn't do Lear, I will be mad.
That would be a good Lear. That's fun. I like his Shakespeare.
I do. I really like his Shakespeare. I think, I guess I should rephrase. I've seen his Henry V, I've seen his Hamlet, and I've seen his Much Ado. I didn't see he did Two Gentlemen, didn't he?
I haven't seen
And
that either. Two
I think he
Gentlemen
did
of
Two
Verona,
Gentlemen. I
which
think
is
he did
supposedly a
Othello.
disaster.
Yeah, and I think he did
Um,
Othello.
he played Iago in
Yeah,
Othello,
he
but
played
that wasn't
Iago, obviously, but
his thing. That
oh,
wasn't
I
his
thought he did that
movie.
one.
He didn't
But
direct it, no.
his Henry V is so good, and I
Hmm.
mean his Hamlet and his Much Ado are the best of those too. I mean
Yeah,
these they were so good,
yeah.
and they're phenomenal. And so now I'm
Mhm.
just like, can you do Lear, just please?
Just stop making Marvel movies and Poirot
Oh, was he in
movies. And
Marvel movies?
he made Thor, the first Thor, which
Oh,
is
okay.
actually a pretty that's worthwhile to watch. It's a pretty entertaining movie. It's also very, very him. For some reason, he kind of bled through the Marvel whatever it was. But it's like really over the top. It looks like a Wagner opera. Like there's these like long-haired,
Well, it's
beautiful
Thor. What are you
men. Yeah,
gonna
exactly.
do?
But
I haven't
instead
seen. I
of
don't know.
the later Thor movies are all sort of like winking at the camera because of it, which is really annoying. Like they become like, look how stupid this is that we're doing this Greek myth, this Norse myth
North
stuff.
Smith.
Um, let's make this into a joke. And with him, he's like, no,
I am
this
taking
is
this
serious. Yeah,
serious.
we're gonna have this is we're not winking. Like there's gonna be beautiful men fighting with hammers on a rainbow bridge in the middle of space, and it's
It's really
which is yeah, and it's pretty fun. It actually is a pretty fun movie.
that'd be fun. I mean, I just have no. I saw the. I mean, again, I don't even know if these count as Marvel Universe or whether they're what they are, but I saw like the. I think the first and the second Avengers, maybe, but those were
Hmm.
like long time ago. I
Yeah,
think,
the
like
first
at this point,
Avengers is
almost.
fine. I think
It
that's
was fine, and then
yeah.
I think I saw the second one because it was filmed outside my building where I worked in New York.
Oh,
So I
oh.
went to go see it simply so we could be like, "Oh yeah, there's our building." Um, and
Yeah.
I don't think I've seen any of the others.
They're they're not quite as bad as you would think. Um,
I've heard some of them are quite good. It's
yeah,
just there was so
there's so
many of
many of
them.
them, and it's also they sort of collapsed in on themselves because they're working in this convention of the movie television show. They're kind of trying to bridge those things. And so they're in the service of advertising for the next episode of their
Yeah.
thing, which is a little annoying. But a few of them are like the first Captain America is certainly worth watching. I think the first and the fourth Avenger movie are worth watching. Um,
See if Christy picks those for one of her
yeah. The
movie
first
nights.
Iron Man is actually also worth watching. It's pretty funny. It's a little more relaxed. And then after that, it just kind of turns into a shitstorm. The third, I would say, the third Spider-Man is worth it too, where they bring all
Oh yeah, yeah. Of the I was thinking, I'm like,
of the third
none of the
trilogy.
Remy ones.
The Remy ones.
What was his name?
Oh,
The
Sam
ones
Raimi. Oh, this
Sam
the
Raimi.
third
Sam
Sam
Raimi.
Raimi one isn't very good, but
Oh, that was one of the few movies I almost walked out on.
yeah,
I was just like, I can't
get
handle it. It was
through
so bad.
this.
But it was such a shame because the second one
It's
is one
great.
of
Yeah.
is probably my favorite superhero movie. Is the one with Doc Ock. I think that's my favorite superhero movie. I love that movie. Um, and so when I went, I remember I was like, I think it came out my senior year, and I was like, I desperately want to go see it because I love Spider-Man 2. Spider-Man 3 was so bad.
Yeah, it was. I felt bad for him because apparently he had no control over how many villains there were. They
I
just
mean,
kept
it was
saying,
obvious. It was so
yeah.
obvious there were too many. It
Mhm.
was like, this is dumb. And then they had emo. I'm like, why does the Venom turn him into emo Spider-Man? I was just like, it was just dumb.
What's the deal with the jazz dancing?
Yeah, it was just like this doesn't even make any sense. It
Uh,
was just so, and I get it. Raimi often has some sort of music montage in in the films. He does it, and sometimes it works, but that one just didn't work. And the whole film just felt like a cobbled together mess.
yeah,
And I
yeah,
just hate it. Was so disappointing because I loved the second one. So those are the only, but again, I didn't really watch superhero movies after that.
yeah. I
Um,
mean, they're not really worth your time, I suppose.
yeah, it's like at this point I'm trying to, I was like last week we were debating between Christy was like I was like, "Oh, maybe we could watch I was trying to pick like a Bogart or I was trying to
Mhm.
like I
Like
was like,
Key
"Oh, it's already
Largo
like
or something. Yeah.
yeah, Lonely Place from A Lonely Place. I was going to do that
Oh,
one.
okay. Hmm.
But I'm like, and then I realized I'm like, it's already like 9:20 and like we go to bed at like this is our late night and it's
Hmm.
like we can't stay up this late. So and I looked, I'm like, oh, Dracula's only like an hour and 20 minutes long. I was like, let's do that. I wanted to watch it. Let's watch Dracula. Um, because you can get like the monster movie sets, and I got the Frankenstein one and I got the Dracula one. So I've like was watching. So I've watched the Frankenstein ones, and I was like, oh, I'll watch the Dracula ones now. I don't know. I just like movies from that time period a lot more. Even you said it. It's just like the atmosphere is better. Just like even the general respect they had for their audience of like we don't need to hammer you with this point. Like, you will get it, and we're gonna move on from it, and we're gonna expect you to remember it 20 minutes later. We don't need to like hammer this point, and we're going to focus on the atmosphere and how these things are going to interact. And it's there are flaws with it, especially at the end. My favorite is when they just have like, they because they killed Dracula very quickly.
Mhm.
Just kind of it's like, especially for an hour and 20 movie, I'm like, you got 10 minutes to kill here, you could drag this out a little longer. And then they just have him kill him, and then it's like, the girl and the guy and Van Helsing are standing there, and they're like, will you come with us? And Van Helsing's like, I will be with you in a few minutes. I have some things I have to do here. And then they just show the two of them walk off. And I was like, oh, you're going to go back to Van Helsing and show me what he's doing. And it was like, oh, no, you just wanted to get the two of them walking down the stairs. You just got him out of the way to make the ending shot. So there are flaws. But overall, it's just like, wow, this is like a billion times better than half the crap that's being made.
Yeah, there seems to be just decades that work for movies and decades that don't. The
Dude,
30s seem to be a decade that works. The 30s into the 40s, the 50s kind of sucks.
50s had some decent ones.
They had
They
decent
had some.
movies.
Sunset Boulevard is good. Uh, Touch of Evil is good.
Yeah, Sunset Boulevard's 1950 too. It's pretty
Oh,
early.
is it 1950? I thought it was older.
1950
Oh, I
and
thought it was like 55.
Touch
Okay,
of
fine.
Evil's
So then
58. Yeah,
Touch of Evil is late,
I'm
but
pretty
Touch
sure
of
Sunset
Evil,
Boulevard's 50.
it could be. I don't
Mm,
remember. I'm not positive, so it
mm.
certainly could be 50. Well, I mean, someone had something online. I can't, if I talked about this last week, where someone had something online, and they were ranking the years of the 90s by the
Mhm.
movies that came. Did I tell you this?
Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm like, it's stunning how many good movies came out of the 90s. Like,
And it doesn't compare to the
shocking.
70s.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Mm.
the 70s had phenomenal. I mean, the 80s had crap, but it's like the 2000s, and but it's like the 2000s have had pretty bad movies. I mean,
Mhm.
Lord of the Rings is really good. Um,
You had good, yeah. I mean, there's always good movies to find. Like, there's just so many movies made. Some of them are really going to be worth returning to again and again. I wonder if part of it now is that television is getting so much better. You can rate and review this show anywhere fine podcasts are available. For those viewing in YouTube land, if you haven't already, please like this video, subscribe to the Talking Studios channel for all our exciting content, and follow us on social media at Talking Studios. Check out other shows by Talking Studios, including Talking Pictures Trivia, where we explore movies through trivia, Keep Making Movies, where we explore micro-budget films, Limited Lexicon, where we play through text-based adventure games, and Get the Point, where we slowly reveal a movie poster and try to guess which movie poster it is. Got a question for us? Call the Talking Studios hotline at 201-467-8679 and leave a message. It may be featured on a future episode. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to Adapt It, wherever fine podcasts are found. If you enjoyed any of these adaptations of Sherlock Holmes and are looking for more adaptations of Sherlock Holmes, check out IMDb to find a listing of quite a large number of movies in many languages, from the early German silent pictures to a television series featuring Lucy Liu. If you feel like watching these, God bless you and enjoy.
check out the Frogware adventure games; those are great.
The what? The Frogware adventure games?
Yeah,
I'd check out the.
and check out the Frogware adventure games. They're actually are really good. They're quite fun. Check them out.
Yeah, check those out as well.
Particularly the one where Sherlock Holmes meets Cthulhu. That's great.
Wow, Talking Studios.
Next week, we'll be discussing Agatha Christie's Hercule Poirot stories and their adaptations. Pat, if you could adapt Poirot into any medium, what would it be?
See, the thing is, I'm sure the idea I have has actually been done, but I'm still just going to say it. I think you should do like one of those those mystery night things, but it should actually be like on the Orient Express, where people like go to Istanbul and then you take that train from there to Calais, and then there's like a murder on board, and you actually then have to go around and like interview people and like try to actually piece it together. I think that would be really fun. I just like the idea, and I think it's part of the fun of Agatha Christie. It's why she's so popular, is because it does feel like you could just be dropped in the middle there and you could really participate in there, because no one needs any special strength or skills or guns. It's just like you could be a dude. I could be a dude on a train. I could
Yeah,
do that.
exactly.
I could be a servant in a country house. I could totally do this. So it just feels like something that people would actually kind of enjoy acting out and living. So I think it should be something like that. And Murder in the Orient Express is like the sort of classic getting a bunch of people together and locking them in a space. So I would do that one. I would make the Murder on the Orient Express, the experience.
So it's a combination of an escape room and dinner theater.
Yes, dinner theater. That was the kind of thing I was thinking of.
Mhm.
Yes.
Yeah,
that
if it
does
was an
sound fun.
escape room with multiple groups coming in, but then one of the groups was the actors, you would literally not know who could be the murderer, and you could have people
Mhm.
disappearing throughout the.
Yeah,
Mhm.
that
I'm
would be a
loving
lot
this,
of
man.
fun.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, there's actually, they do every year by me for the kids the Polar Express ride, where you actually get on a train and they enact the entire Polar Express, which is fine if you're 4, but for the rest of us, it's, a thing you do for 4-year-olds. But yeah, I could see that adjusted for adults in some way.
What about you, KJ?
I was thinking about the ABC murders. And I think it'd be really fun to do the Sesame Street ABC murders. So growing up, I think I only watched one episode of Sesame Street. My mom taped it, and then it was on demand whenever we wanted. We put the tape in, and I think I only ever watched one episode. And in the episode, they're going through the alphabet trying to find objects that start with A, B, C. And then I remember Snuffleupagus at the end of the episode brings Big Bird an apple, and Big Bird's like, dude, the episode's over. We did A like 40 minutes ago. This is terrible.
That's really funny. They have a good sense of humor.
Yeah.
So I'm picturing, right? Like maybe Abby Cadabra dies, and then Bert. And then eventually we work our way down to Elmo. No! And they got to figure out who it is. Yeah, the ABC murders of Sesame
I
Street.
like this.
Very good, yeah.
I'm actually legitimately. I would be not surprised if they actually have done something like that, where they have some reference to it, because they do things. They do have like references to a lot of other material. I remember Tom, like we used to have a professor who talked about the favorite one was when it's just like a random thing and they just have an exit sign moving across the screen, and then a bear starts chasing it, which is a reference to like a very famous line in Shakespeare of like exit pursued by bear. And it has no context. Like no child has any chance of getting it. Most of the adults won't get it. It's just whoever made the show was like, this will be a funny filler. So I could see them doing something like that. They do make pretty good jokes on that show. They have my favorite is also Waiting. Have you ever seen Waiting for Elmo?
I haven't, no.
There's a Waiting for Elmo where they have just like two of two of them are sitting there. I don't remember who it is. I think it's like Grover and somebody else, and they're just talking, and they're like, and there's a tree above them, and they're like, "We are here waiting for Elmo, waiting, waiting." And then finally, they just keep talking about how they're waiting for Elmo, and then finally the tree just goes and is like, "I don't understand what's happening. Why are we still waiting for Elmo?" And it just wanders off the stage. I'm like, no, it's a reference to Waiting for Godot. No kid's gonna get it, but it's really funny reference. So I think the ABC Murders has a lot. Sesame Street ABC Murders has a lot of
Think it's
I'll
gonna
lie down
work.
for
I
it.
guess a lot.
Yeah.
It's got legs. It's got legs.
It's got legs. Mm-hmm.
Or does it? How about you, Tom? What would your adaptation be?
Mine isn't as exciting. I wanted to get the Hercule Poirot beard oil to treat your beard, your mustache if you have it. I went for the beard oil instead of just the mustache oil because the beard seems to be in now. But I think the Hercule Poirot mustache oil, beard oil, whatever you want to call it, I think that would be an absolute delight and would probably smell delicious as well.
Here's the tagline: figure out what to do with your beard.
Ah, there
Or
we
maybe
go.
figure. You'd have to say it
Like, solve your beard problem.